Good afternoon. Hi there. Good afternoon. My name is Gail Fisher, and as a past chairperson of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and a current DIA docent, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening event of the 72nd Detroit Annual Jewish Book Fair, the oldest and largest Jewish book fair in the nation. This event could not take place without our partner, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I thank them for their enthusiastic support of this ongoing collaboration. Brushed Aside, The Untold Story of Women in Art by Dr. Noah Charney brings together the patrons of these two prestigious Detroit institutions, illuminating the mission of both organizations. And Noah is joining us remotely from Germany. Since 2017, even remotely during COVID, the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and the Detroit Institute of Arts have joined together to showcase authors who exemplify their institutions. Past speakers such as Blake Gottnip, Hugh Eakin, and Father Patrick Desbois, among others, have enriched our knowledge of the DIA's collection through a new Jewish lens. As we explore the history or herstory of Art Without Men, I am proud to announce that this program is ahead of the curve, as our 2019 featured speaker was Mary Gabriel, the author of 9th Street Women. As Gabriel's book celebrated 5 women artists who shook up the male-dominated world of 20th century abstract painting, Dr. Charney's book examines over 500 years of art where women, for mainly sexist and misogynic reasons, were brushed aside. As a DIA docent, I am frequently asked, where are the Picassos? Can you point me to Rivera Court? Is the Bruegel still on view? Unfortunately, I have never been asked the location of art by Artemisia Gentileschi, Edmonia Lewis, and Marina Abranovich, all acclaimed women artists. This book, in a very engaging and enlightening fashion, celebrates women artists and shows that there always has been great women artists, along with accomplished women patrons, curators, scholars, and critics, to show a 360-degree view of women in art. Though not a definitive history of art, Brushed Aside shines a much-needed light on overlooked women artists, many who have paved the way for artists today. Following Noah Charney's conversation with Judith Dulcart, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. This event will conclude with a book sale in the Great Hall, with all books having a signed book plate by the author. Tours of celebrated women artists, many mentioned by Noah in his presentation, will be held by our rock star DIA docents who will be stationed in the Great Hall after the presentation. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to welcome Anthony Smith, Vice President for Learning and Audience Engagement at the DIA, to say a few words.
Good afternoon. I'd like to, first of all, welcome everybody to the Detroit Institute of Arts, voted the best museum in America by USA Today readers, right? I'd also like to extend a very special welcome and thanks to Noah Charney for sharing your research and stories that you uncovered about overlooked women throughout art history. I think you will see a strong connection or connections between the themes in Mr. Charney's book to those that exist in our incredible collection at the DIA. Mr. Charney tells the story of the artist Artemisia Gentileschi and the painting of Judith in Holofernes, which is one of the most treasured pieces in our collection and one to which we recently devoted an entire exhibition. Also, welcome to our partner who will help develop this event, the Jewish Community Center and the 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair, the longest running Jewish book fair in the United States. As you sit in this beautiful, newly renovated auditorium in a museum full of paintings and sculptures, know that the DIA is about more than art. We are also about sharing stories of each other's histories and cultures. Noah Charney will share stories through an author's lens. Our collection is filled with objects that share histories and cultures through the eyes of artists. Both perspectives are important and connected as we strive to learn from and with each other to create a better future. I hope you enjoy this event and come back to visit our world-class collection at your DIA. Now, I would like to introduce the JCC Senior Director of Cultural Arts, Stephen Kantrowitz. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Kantrowitz, Senior Director of Cultural Arts at the JCC of Metro Detroit. On behalf of the J, I'd like to thank Anthony Smith, Vice President of Learning and Audience Development and Engagement, Jason Gillespie, the Walters Family Director of Education Programs, and everyone at the DIA who helped bring this outstanding program to you today. I invite everyone here to become a patron or sponsor of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and help us bring programs like this to the J and throughout Metro Detroit. Please visit www.jccdet.org/bookfair. And now, Gail.
Dr. Noah Charney is a professor of art history specializing in art crime and has taught for Yale University, Brown University, among others, and is the founder of the groundbreaking research group, the Association for Research into Arts Against Crime. Dr. Charney writes regularly for dozens of major magazines and newspapers, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, and The Observer. He is also a TV and radio presenter for the BBC and award-winning podcast host. Dr. Charney is the author of more than a dozen books translated into 14 languages, including The Collector of Lives, which was nominated for the 2017 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. Dr. Charney holds master's degrees in art history from the Courtauld Institute and University of Cambridge, and a PhD from the University of Ljubljana. He lives in Slovenia with his wife, children, and their hairless dog, Herbert Van Eyck. Judith Dolkart is a Deputy Director of Art Education and Programs at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Ms. Dolkart previously was the Director of the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy and was the Gunn Family Chief Curator at the Barnes Foundation. Ms. Dolkart received her BA from Harvard Radcliffe Colleges and her MA from the University of Pennsylvania. Please help me in welcoming Judith Dolkart and Dr. Noah Charney.
Noah, welcome. You're on.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor. Thank you so much for bringing me into your program, which is admirable, and what a great institution to be able to give a talk at, even virtually. It's dark over here. I'm actually in Berlin at the moment, but that won't stop me from giving this talk that I'm actually prepared just for you. This is the first of the talks on this new book of mine. So you're all the guinea pigs. Just briefly a little bit about my work. As Gail mentioned, I do lots of different things that are not all traditional. I'm basically like a pop professor. I do teach at university, but only occasionally. And I do things that are more to do with outreach to the maximum possible audience. So I get very excited when I can introduce stories about art, interest in museums, interest in history to people who otherwise might not think to turn to it. One of my favorite tricks to lure people in is to talk about true crime involving works of art. People think they like true crime. Everybody likes true crime stories, but not everybody thinks they're going to like the art stories. And so that's been one of my approaches. But I've become much more expansive in the things that I write about. And when I was writing my 2017 book, Collector of Lives, which is a biography of Giorgio Vasari, I was struck by his chapter on female artists and the fact that they get very little recognition. And one of the things that I felt was unfortunate is that even I, as an art history professor, had trouble naming a number of pre-modern era women artists. I could come up with maybe a dozen or so, and most people I would talk to could come up with even fewer. And that struck me as a shame, and it's frankly part of the patriarchal mess that we live in and have done for centuries. But I know that there have been good books about women artists in particular. What I was interested in doing was something a little bit different. My book tries to look at how women collectively have shaped the art world, including artists, of course, but also involving patrons, collectors, influencers, critics, scholars, muses, models, far beyond the creators themselves. And so I wound up doing a lot of different media with the same stories that I try to tell. So I'll do things like host a television program or a radio series or a podcast. And I find through these different media, you essentially access different people. Many of the stories can overlap, but often one project will lead into another. So this is a project that I really felt very deeply about wanting to do. I felt a little bit shy, not being a specialist in women in art, not being a woman. I also felt a little bit shy, perhaps inappropriately, but I thought if this book hadn't yet been written in the way that I envisioned it, that I might as well give it a go myself. And I hope that the result is something that you'll all enjoy. So I'll begin with this question. How many female artists can you name? Now, you're probably the wrong audience for this, because if you are familiar with the DIA, then you can probably name a lot of women artists. So, if you ask the average person on the street, then the answer is, maybe Frida Kahlo, maybe Georgia O'Keeffe, Marina Abramovic, but that might be it. And what about female artists who lived prior to the modern era? Artemisia Gentileschi is likely to be the number one, but after that, even a regular museum goer might run out of steam. There's this colossal gap in the offering of books about art. And when I did a quick Amazon search prior to pitching this book to my editor, I searched for women in art, and the chasm revealed itself. There were monographs dealing with some prominent female artists, especially like Frida Kahlo, Mary Cassatt, Georgia O'Keeffe. And there's some encyclopedic gallery books that show one work by each female artist. For instance, there's a very good Fiden book that shows 400 women artists, but each one had one image and one little paragraph about her role. Now, there's a historical reason for the limited presence of women as artists until the 20th century. Art, as almost all professions, was considered the realm of men, and the patriarchal society, deliberately designed to be institutionally misogynistic, upheld this. Until the 18th century, a guild system was in place that controlled who was permitted in a given city or region to run a professional artistic studio. The so-called masters of the guild, inevitably called the Guild of St. Luke, Luke being the patron saint of painters due to the apocryphal story that he painted an icon portrait of the Virgin Mary. Well, they were all men, and only men were accepted, should they submit what was called a masterpiece. And it had to be of sufficient quality. This is the original of the term, which we now use rather loosely to mean any outstanding work. The original term was the masterpiece was what you as an aspiring artist would submit to the guild, and based on that, they would determine whether you could become a master and have your own studio. There was also the practical reason that artist studios were basically like gym locker rooms of the Renaissance. the master would supervise a group of paid assistants and unpaid apprentices, all men and boys aged 8 and up, and many living on site. At the time, it would have been considered both awkward and maybe even a romantic distraction to have girls in the midst of the studio. This meant that, with precious few exceptions, the only female artists prior to the dissolution of the guild system were relatives of established masters. The most famous of the bunch is one known well to all of you, Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the great painters of Baroque Italy, who learned her craft because her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was likewise a great painter with his own studio in which she could practice. Women created art informally throughout history as a hobby, but often exhibiting brilliant talent. But it was the professional gates that remained closed to them. They began to open somewhat when the guild system shifted to a system of academies, the first of which opened in Florence in the 16th century. But these were likewise run by men for men. Although the number of female professional artists expanded in the 19th century, they were exceptions to the rule and were often looked upon, unfortunately, as curiosities, complemented with variations on the odoriferously misogynistic, but at the time well-meaning phrase, quote, "She paints so well, you'd think she was a man." By the time the 20th century rolled around, thankfully, female artists were no longer rare, and particularly after the First World War, with painting schools finally open to them, the guild chokehold weakened, and an increasing acceptance of women in the workplace in the still patriarchal societies the world over meant that there was no shortage of excellent and influential female artists. But prior to the 20th century, they can really be counted in the dozens. Now, this slide will look familiar to you, I'm sure. So there have been many more than this, of course, but the problem with history is that it is written largely by men about men, with a focus on revolutionaries, artists who changed everything: Giotto, Michelangelo, Caravaggio, Turner, Picasso, Duchamp. Female artists prior to the 20th century never really had the chance to be revolutionary in their output because they were obliged to work within an established style and weren't permitted enough influence to establish their own, which might be carried on by followers, because they were not allowed to run their own studios. Artemisia was an early exception as a tragic but ultimately empowered female painter who, after having endured rape at the hands of her art teacher in Rome, moved to Florence and was the breadwinner of her family, raising children while fulfilling prominent commissions. It takes a proactive search to find women artists before the modern era, and most readers will have never seen a single work by any of them, unfortunately, with the possible exception of Artemisia's magnificent and gruesome Judith beheading Holofernes. And I show this slide side by side with the Caravaggio because, frankly, hers is far better. When I first studied art history, I learned from one of the classic Art History 101 tomes, which had a self-portrait by a great female artist, Adelaide Labille-Guiard, on its cover. But this only underscored the paucity of female artists within the book, and I counted. There are 16 of them, as opposed to 250 men, and there were no women at all in the previous versions. So with my book, I hope to definitively fill this gap, to take a step to righting this wrong. I look at female artists, of course, and do so through an alternative history of art, a herstory of art, if you forgive the pun, in which the key movements are represented by my choice of a female artist's work, including painters, printmakers, sculptors, conceptual artists, photographers. The goal was also to avoid the Eurocentricity of most art history books, incorporating female artists from a variety of cultures and geographies. But the book does more than this, broadly providing what I hope is a 360-degree look at the role, influence, and empowerment of women through art, beyond those who have taken up the brush or the chisel. So I chatted with Judith, who was very helpful, and we decided on a few case studies to choose from to go over with you before we go into a more open-ended discussion. And so we opted for a look at 4 women artists of the Renaissance, because that was a specialty of the DIA. And then we'll look at a couple of examples of how women have influenced beyond the creatives before we turn to a discussion and question and answer. It can be difficult to find female artists who were truly influential to the course of art before the 19th century. Difficult, but not impossible. Contrary to the thesis of the most famous feminist art essay ever written, Linda Naughlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? There have, I would argue, been many great women artists, even prior to the modern era. There were certainly fewer among the old masters, as fine artists of the pre-modern era are frequently and patriarchally called, and fewer still whose names have survived the centuries. Those who did work as professional artists, usually because their father was an artist, rarely had an enduring independent career that made an impact on the art scene and thus influenced other almost exclusively male artists. And yet some women did, even in these early centuries when their opportunities were severely constrained. And among them are numerous standouts, exceptions to the rule. There are and have been great women artists, earlier than you might realize and more influential than you might think. So let's take a look at the first one I picked. Now, it's always hard to choose from this abundance of good case studies, but this is a good one to start with. Much of what we know of Renaissance art history comes to us through Giorgio Vasari's The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, first published in 1550 with a second edition in 1562. This is considered the first art history book proper, making Vasari the godfather of the field of study. Essentially, it's a group biography of important artists, many of whom Vasari, court painter and architect to Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, knew personally. Now, he mentions a few women artists, and they must have been truly noteworthy for him to include them, since his Tuscan-focused outlook on what makes for art worthy of inclusion resulted in him sidelining or entirely excluding some very important artists from elsewhere in Italy or Europe. Now, the only woman to receive a full chapter on her life was Properzia de' Rossi of Bologna. It's within the Properzia chapter that Vasari mentions some other women artists of note. He quotes the medieval poet Ludovico Ariosto in this chapter, quote, "Women have achieved excellence in every art they have given care to." Vasari backs this up in his text on Properzia and Sofinisba Anguissola, of whom more in a moment. This was impressive since some of the most famous male artists of the Renaissance, including Albrecht Dürer and Jan van Eyck, did not receive chapters of their own, while Properzia did. Vasari lavishes praise on Properzia, though today, unfortunately, it reads as underhandedly misogynistic, and I quote Vasari, "Nor have women been ashamed to put their tender white hands to mechanical things, and amid the coarseness of marble and the roughness of iron, to follow their desires and bring fame to themselves, as did our Properzia de' Rossi, a young woman talented not only in household matters, but in infinite forms of knowledge that are the envy of men as well as women." He meant well, I promise. It sounds a little awkward today. This was high praise back in 1550. Properzia had an unusual specialty in sculpture that's going to sound very weird if you've never heard of it before, carving miniatures out of peach pits. This was once an admired art form, believe it or not, which he, quote, "executed so well and with such patience that they were singular and marvelous to behold, not only for the subtlety of the work, but also for the grace of the little figures that she made in them and the delicacy with which they distributed." She even sculptured, supposedly, quote, "the whole Passion of Christ wrote in most beautiful carvings, with a vast number of figures in addition to the apostles and the ministers of the crucifixion, in a single peach pit." I don't know how she did this. Unfortunately, this is a lost work of art. I have a whole book called Museum of Lost Art just on objects that are no longer with us. And unfortunately, almost all of her peach pits are missing. You see one example in the slide here beside a portrait of her. So Vasari shows a level of misogyny depressingly normal for this era, but he was astounded that a woman could also hew marble, considering their, quote, little hands so tender and white. Sorry, that's what he wrote. Alas, her carved peach pits do not survive aside from this one, but she was also known for her carved marble relief sculpture, Joseph and Potiphar's Wife from 1526, which is the indicative artwork of the High Renaissance in this book. You know, you don't have to pick a sculpture by Michelangelo or Donatello. You can pick one by Properzia as the exemplary sculpture from this period. Sculpting marble required considerable physical strength to go with subtlety. It was messy, muscly work, leaving the sculptors covered in dust and powdered stone, which may have made the medium appear less attractive to women than, say, the more elegant work with paint, because sculptors are even rarer than female painters. As with so much high Renaissance art, the scene is balanced and harmonious. There's some drama in the poses and flexed muscles, particularly of Potiphar's wife, whose robust arms and frankly unrealistic breasts recall Michelangelo's depiction of women, rather than something more naturalistic. Potiphar's wife is shown as sexual aggressor in this piece and is physically more capable of overcoming Joseph than the other way around. This is a powerful woman who will take what she wants, and was a rare example of a work of this period that featured the woman as an aggressor. Now, in the Hall of Fame of fantastic names, one of my favorites is Sophonisba Anguissola. If I put her in a book, you'd think I was making it up probably, but what a great name. Vasari traveled through his native Italy and thought so highly of Sophonisba that he stopped in Cremona to visit her. Quote, this year in Cremona, I saw in her father's house a painting by her hand made with great diligence, showing her 3 sisters playing chess, and with them an old housemaid with such diligence and attention that they truly seemed to be alive and missing nothing but the power of speech. This was Sophonisba's best-known painting, The Game of Chess from 1555. The Anguissola family belonged to Cremona's aristocracy, as indicated by the sisters' gorgeous brocades and the expensive lace at their collars and cuffs in a group portrait painted by Sophonisba, not to mention the fact that they have the leisure to play chess and study painting. Quote, their father, Amilcare Anguissola, ensured that his daughters had a superb education and promoted their skills in the arts without fearing that a career would compromise their marriageability. High birth granted them a certain degree of independence, end quote. Sophonisba was a proper star of her time. She studied with Michelangelo in Rome and was a court painter to King Philip II of Spain. This demonstrates her independence and the support of her father in that he did not interfere. By contrast, if we introduce Marietta Robusti, a daughter of the Venetian master Tintoretto, she was an artist of such renown that she was invited to be the court painter to Emperor Maximilian II and then to Philip II of Spain, and both times her father Tintoretto forbade her. Sophonisba's sophistication was such that she befriended Philip II's wife, Queen Elizabeth of Valois. Such a friendship would not have been possible among those of vastly different social strata. She continued to work as a sought-after artist for decades. Her reputation was such that the great painter Antony van Dyck asked to paint her portrait in 1624 when she was 92 years old, or so she claimed. She was trying to sound a little bit younger. She was actually 96. Van Dyck commented that he learned more from her about painting than anyone else. While it is difficult to trace where artists acquired elements of their style, it's clear that there are aesthetic differences between the work of Van Dyck and of the master with whom he trained and initially worked, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens's portraits are looser in terms of brushstroke, more painterly, which is a term that means that the brushstrokes are visible, not smoothed out. Van Dyck's later work appears to be a halfway point between Rubens's brushstrokey style and Sophonisba's unpainterly crispness. The painting on the right, Portrait of Elizabeth of Valois holding a portrait of Philip II, shows the third wife of Philip, the Habsburg emperor. The face, eyes, and hand are immediately arresting, stopping the viewer in our tracks. But the real star of the show is perhaps the gorgeous dress, its sleeves lined with fasteners carved of diamonds and rubies, trimmed with velvet and woven throughout with silver and gold thread, its front studded with pearls. It was hugely expensive, and its softness and texture are expertly conveyed by Sofonisba. No easy feat to transform oil paints into something that feels like you could feel it with your fingers. This is an example of a painting that was once attributed to a male artist, Sanchez Coelho. Too often, the default assumption for truly great artworks is that they were surely the hand of a man, when in fact they were not. But analysis of the composition of the lead white paint used matches what Anguissa used in other paintings, differing from the chemical composition of what was considered the most difficult of Coelho. Elaborate costumes, faces, and hands offered the best chance for an artist to show off, as these were considered the most difficult for a painter to get right. There's also this look of quiet confidence in Elizabeth's face. Perhaps it took a female portraitist to highlight a woman's great interior qualities, while a male portraitist would cater to the male viewers of the work and convey only the superficial beauty of the princess, or show her in a more submissive light. I like the idea that Anguissa saw a kindred, empowered woman in Elizabeth and helped to preserve her legacy. The leading artistic style for both Sofonisba and Lavinia, who we see here, was called Mannerism, a movement that rose among the followers of Michelangelo. This is a work by Lavinia Fontana, who is a leading Mannerist painter. We see a work of hers that probably looks very unusual to you on one side and a portrait of her on the right. While high Renaissance art was all about harmony and balanced geometric compositions, Mannerism expanded on Michelangelo's interest in hyper-extending bodies and posing figures in elegant but unnatural forms, introducing bright colors, twisting and bending for aesthetic effect. Here in Lavinia's portrait of Antonietta Gonzalez from 1595, one does a double take. Antonietta, as well as her two sisters and father, had a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis, which colloquially and not very sensitively was called at the time werewolf syndrome, which causes abnormal hair growth on the face and body. Hailing from the Canary Islands, her father is a historical point of reference as the first documented case of hypertrichosis in the world. The disease is incredibly rare, making it that much more surprising that all three Gonzalez sisters and their father had it. A doctor noted, quote, "The Gonzalez sisters were 1 in a billion, all three of them." Antonietta and her family toured the courts of Europe as living natural wonders. This was at a time when sensitivity was not on most people's minds, but the family made a comfortable living by exhibiting themselves. Antonietta is painted with such empathy by Lavinia, with lively eyes and a warm expression, that she happens to cloak in hair, which seems almost an afterthought. In her hands, Lavinia has painted her holding a document that describes an aspect of her story. It says, quote, "Don Pietro, a wild man discovered in the Canary Islands, was conveyed to His Most Serene Highness, Henry the King of France, and from there came to His Excellency the Duke of Parma." This is where Lavinia likely met and was commissioned to portray Antonietta. Lavinia trained with her father, Prospero Fontana, a painter in Bologna, but she was truly the star of the family, and her husband, a painter named Paolo Zappi, was relegated to painting the draperies in the background of her work. As with Vasari's words of praise for Properzia, one of Lavinia's patrons spoke warmly of her, albeit with that inbuilt misogyny that was the norm of the time, when he said, quote, "This excellent painter, to say the truth, in every way prevails above the condition of her sex, and is a most remarkable person." Of course, Lavinia was great by any standard, but though this sounds like damning with faint praise, it was meant as a major compliment when it was penned in the 16th century. Let's look at one more artist now, because of course we have a finite amount of time and there are loads that I could choose from. But one of the things that I wanted to do in this book is not give that prejudice that too often we have in art history, which is focusing on the major art styles. So painting, architecture, sculpture, maybe photography tend to take precedence over other art forms that are sometimes dismissed as craft and therefore given a lower rank on the hierarchy of creativity, but really shouldn't because they exhibit extraordinary skill. The major art forms that steal the headlines are just those: painting, sculpture, and architecture. Later on, printmaking and photography were added to the list. But there were these art forms that many considered mere crafts that should perhaps be considered on par with the big three. They just have not been historically included. Too often, art historians have a narrow view of which media count among the fine arts. This has historical roots. Painting, sculpture, and architecture have been the foci since the Renaissance. Countless other media were sidelined as crafts rather than art forms, but this is an artificial distinction, and many crafts were elevated by master artisans to realms as sophisticated as any more storied medium. Among the many overlooked art forms, needlework stands out as one that was almost exclusively the realm of women, but which required no less skill, patience, imagination, and dedication than other media. One of the most notable figures in the documented history of needlework was Elizabeth Talbot, better known as Bess of Hardwicke. She was among the most prominent figures in Elizabethan England, a brilliant woman who strategically married 4 times, always adding to her wealth and power, which she used for good. Bess was renowned as, quote, a needlewoman, adept at decorative sewing and handicrafts involving textiles. This was an art form taught to noble women. An embroidered book cover by Queen Elizabeth, for example, Queen Elizabeth I, survives, created when she was only 11, but with a fascinating, complex design of interlocking hoops. Bess's first husband was briefly in charge of keeping Mary, Queen of Scots, captive at his estate, Chatsworth House. There, Bess befriended Mary, and the two worked on a series of needlework hangings called the Oxburgh Hangings, as they decorated a room in Oxburgh Hall, Norfolk, in England. The hangings were made between 1570 and 1585. They were designed by Mary, and Bess helped her with them for the first few years of the project. The design is hugely elaborate, with multiple hangings intended to decorate a wall, 2 bed curtains, and a valance, which is the term for the skirting of a bed, as well as other elements of the room. There are over 100 panels within the hangings, with designs inspired by a collection of woodcut illustrations that Mary kept with her in captivity. Mary and Bess each signed the panels they made with their monogram initials, MA for Mary and ES for Bess. Bess's marriages led her to being described as, quote, one of the richest and most powerful women in the kingdom, reportedly the 2nd richest in England, right behind Queen Elizabeth. As a result, she was both an artist and a powerful patron of arts and architecture. She commissioned many buildings and likely also had significant influence on their design, including Hardwicke Hall, Old Coates, and Chatsworth House, though they were officially designed by others, male architects. Hardwicke Hall, designed by Robert Smithson, famously had a quantity of glazing that astounded those who saw it, leading to a rhyme, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. This design was influential on subsequent grand houses, and it suggested that Bess of Hardwicke was one of the engineers of that design. So we've looked over 4 women artists, and now I have another section that would look at patrons. But let me ask Judith, do you want to come hang out with me and go through these together, or should I plow ahead before we team up together?
You should go ahead.
Okay.
We're all enjoying it. So.
Okay, if you're in the groove, I don't want to funk up the groove.
You've gotten laughs in all the right moments too. So.
Okay, well, good. That's great. Excellent. Okay, plowing ahead for a few more slides. So let's talk a little bit about famous female patrons, and here's one of them. I'm in Berlin right now. I just went to visit her. This is the bust of Nefertiti. The precise role of royal wives in artistic patronage can be difficult to determine. Take, for example, one of the most famous of all Egyptian artworks, the bust of Nefertiti, which dates to 1345 BCE. This is absence. I'm calling you having seen it just yesterday, where the bust is kept at one of the Berlin museums. Nefertiti was the wife of a powerful pharaoh, Akhenaten, who changed the course of ancient Egyptian history by establishing a new monotheistic religion, Atonism, built around Aten, the sun disk, which had previously been an attribute of Ra, the god of the sun, as part of Egypt's polytheistic religion. Some scholars think that Nefertiti was actually co-regent, a term for co-ruler with Akhenaten, from 1352 to 1336, and may briefly have been the sole ruler when Akhenaten died in 1334 BCE. Theirs was a family of women. They had 6 daughters, one of whom would marry the young Tutankhamun, or King Tut, the most famous of all pharaohs. The bust that we see here is the most copied artwork of the Egyptian tradition and is considered an icon of beauty, even in modern times, thanks to its high-profile discovery in 1912 by a German archaeologist, which was much covered in world media. Whether or not Nefertiti was active as a patron and was involved in commissioning her own bust portrait, which was carved by the sculptor Thutmose, is unknown. But the bust and her reputation through it was hugely influential to artists and has been held up as the icon of beauty since its excavation. It's been called, for example, the Mona Lisa of the ancient world. And while that might not be the best analogy, it is so startlingly more realistic and frankly engaging than any other work of ancient Egyptian art I've ever seen that it immediately stops you in your tracks. Other royal wives of ancients provided similar question marks as to how proactive they were in art's patronage. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the tomb of Mausolus from 350 BCE, that's the ruler of Cadia, which is a part of today's Turkey, and it's where we get the term mausoleum from. It was likely commissioned after his death by his wife, who happened to also be his sister, Artemisia II, who ruled for 2 years after he died. The tomb was topped with a statue of a quadriga, a chariot pulled by 4 horses, on which stood a likeness of Mausolus and Artemisia. Because of the belief that Artemisia commissioned this wonder of the world, some European women patrons modeled their own commissions on those of this Hellenistic queen, whose patronage was seen as an act of devotion to her deceased husband. It was sort of the reverse story that you might have heard about the Taj Mahal, the palace in Agra, India, built between 1631 and 1653 by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan as a tomb to his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. It's important to keep in mind that influence can emerge from either the patron or the inspiration, the muse or the commemorated. Next up in brief, I would mention Alexandra Lisowska, or Roxelana, which is a term that means the Russian girl, as she was called. She was an Ottoman empress portrayed here by Titian. Like some other ancient empresses, she rose from the most modest of origins. She was a villager in Rohatin, a part of modern Ukraine, when her village was attacked by Turkish soldiers and she was kidnapped. She was sold at a slave market in Istanbul to become a concubine to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's harem, one of some 150 wives. From this most traumatic of starts, though, she rose to become his first wife, the royal favorite. She was given the moniker Hürrem Sultan, meaning the joyful, and seemed to enjoy a loving union with the Sultan. Not only did he have more than one child with her, tradition required that a sultan to have only one child with any one member of his harem, but he also married her, thereby freeing her from concubinage and granting her the title of Haseki Sultan. She commissioned a palace complex in Constantinople called Haseki, designed by Mimar Sinan, which was like its own village with a hospital, soup kitchen, mosque, and school, all part of it. She would also fund building projects throughout the Ottoman Empire, in Jerusalem and in Mecca, overseeing a territory that stretched thousands of miles and included over 100 million people. After a fire damaged it, she moved into her husband's Topkapi palace, which was likewise unheard of. This led to what was called, quote, the reign of women. At her encouragement, the Sultan built the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent, as Muzaffar Uzkidus wrote, and, quote, reshaped the patronage of all Ottoman women builders who came after her. It was said that Roxolana was not particularly beautiful, but her wit, charm, and goodness won her the Sultan's heart and made her the most influential woman in the history of the Ottoman Empire. I'd like to just mention two other subcategories of how women have influenced art before we chat more casually. So we've talked about patrons. We also have a term I would use, influencers, which is often the case with prominent wealthy women who used their wealth and influence for the greater good of the art world and often supporting women artists. A number of prominent wealthy women, the original ladies who lunch crowd, the implication of the idiom being influential society women who meet over power lunches to shape new trends, were the co-founders of New York's Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, as well as patrons and influencers more generally. And there were three very dear friends who we have to thank for the foundation of MoMA and really bringing contemporary art to the fore in New York and in America in general. The first to mention on the left is Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. Her tastes were modern and avant-garde, which ran against the grain in her society circles. Her husband was stoic and conservative, a John named John D. Rockefeller, the son of the famous oil magnate. She bought up works by Georgia O'Keeffe, Diego Rivera, and Matisse, all of whom were considered far too radical to be in good taste. She was a famous hostess and philanthropist, particularly interested in championing women's rights and women in the arts. She ignored the mutterings of her conservative husband and his circle of friends and did what she felt compelled to do. She hosted Matisse for lunch, was friends with painter Marguerite Zoac, and commissioned Diego Rivera to paint a mural at Rockefeller Center, the fanciest among her husband's many properties, and the mural was sadly and absurdly destroyed in 1934 because Rivera had included a portrait of Lenin in it. Lily P. Bliss, whose Boston family ran a textile empire, was parallel to Isabella Stewart Gardner in her anti-establishment devil-may-care approach to life. She insisted on chauffeuring herself around town in a Pierce Arrow limousine. She collected art and was not interested in getting married, in itself revolutionary for her time and socioeconomic status. She was among the earliest modern art collectors in America, buying up work by Monet, Gauguin, Modigliani, Seurat, Daumier, Picasso, Pissarro, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Cézanne. In a 1931 catalog of Bliss's collection, Eleanor Robson Belmont wrote, quote, she was an advocate for modern art when it had few admirers, a patron when it had almost no market. And while Bliss and Aldrich Rockefeller were among the uber wealthy, the third key cog in the foundation of the museum was of humbler pedigree. Mary Quinn Sullivan was an art teacher and an artist herself, as well as an activist. For a brief period, she lived at the home of Catherine Sophie Dreyer, another very influential woman artist. She studied art at Pratt in New York and studied art education in Europe. She bought her first pieces at the 1913 Armory Show, the first major show in the US to introduce modern, rather contemporary European artists. She married a rare book collector, Cornelius Sullivan, and together they expanded their art collection to include many of the big names of the time, Modigliani, Picasso, Van Gogh, and Cézanne. They could afford to do this even though they weren't super wealthy because these were not popular names. These three women really were pioneers in shifting the interest in which artists were of value, what would endure, and what was the very best of contemporary art. These three women met for a very important lunch in November 1929 with a new plan in mind to open a public museum focused exclusively on contemporary art. At the time, no such museum existed in New York. It predated the Guggenheim Museum by a decade, and there were few elsewhere. Contemporary art was seen as the realm of salons, shows like the Armory Show, and galleries selling work. Museums at the time were reserved only for the old classics. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, quote, routinely refused to show or accept donations of contemporary artwork, unquote, according to Alexa Gotthard in an article on women who built New York's art scene. It didn't take long. Aldrich Rockefeller encouraged her husband to donate some of his real estate to provide the museum with a sculpture garden and to underwrite the entire museum project. Before the year had passed, the Museum of Modern Art would open at 730 Fifth Avenue. Its collection was kickstarted by Bliss, who donated the 150 best pieces from her private stash to it. She would also spend the next 2 years until her death at the helm of the museum. Aldrich Rockefeller donated 181 works to MoMA, as it would become known, including pieces by Van Gogh and Seurat. Quinn Sullivan developed the didactic and educational aspect of the proposed Museum of Modern Art. The museum would become the preeminent institution on art that was, when it was founded, contemporary, and which has since become categorized as modern. And finally, I'd like to mention scholarship. And there's so many scholars to choose from, also curators, but I chose one who is safe to assume is on anyone's list of the most influential scholars of the 20th century, male or female, Susan Sontag. One cannot write about photography or visual theory in general without invoking the work of Susan Sontag. She's shown here in a 1975 photograph. She was one of America's most respected and prominent public intellectuals from the late 1960s until her death in 2004. Her theories include the idea that art has overtaken the role that religion, whether formal like Catholicism or generally one's spiritual or mystical tendencies, once provided, a role that was important for the psyche. That unknowing or having aspects of one's life that cannot be scientifically squared away or defined is productive, quenching our human, quote, craving for the cloud of unknowing beyond knowledge and for the silence beyond speech. Conceptual art that is not easily explained away through a series of equations, symbol X means this, symbol Y means that, now serves the role that the mystical myths of religion once did, now that so much of our modern world is a-religious. She wrote on a wide array of topics, but her 1977 On Photography is required reading for students on the subject and has been for decades. She wrote that photography leads to a, quote, chronic voyeuristic relation to the world. We are so inundated with images, with the ubiquity of photography, that each photograph tends to be stripped of meaning and weight. We want to see more and more, but it results in an indifference to what we see, an attitude of anti-intervention. We might see a heart-wrenching photograph like Dorothea Lange's Immigrant Mother, but rather than rally to help immigrant families, we simply stow away the image and move on to the next one. She argued that a photographer seeking to record what they see with their camera cannot intervene in the situation, and that someone who does not intervene in the situation cannot truly record it as it is. So this was a contradiction in terms, but it echoed what Dorothea Lange described as encountering with the immigrant family in question. I realize I should have the slide here, but you probably have in your mental memory the image of Immigrant Mother photographed by Dorothea Lange, who photographed immigrants in the Dust Bowl during the Great Depression, and was torn by this idea that she should be proactively helping this compassionate side of her, but and that it was sort of not right to be taking photographs of it, but at the same time, in order to objectively record the scene, she couldn't intervene in a more visceral manner, and that by recording the scene objectively, she might be able to help the cause indirectly by bringing that image to the masses. On Photography won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism and Writing in 1977, and writing in 1998, critic Michael Starenko wrote, quote, "On Photography has become so deeply absorbed into this discourse that Sontag's claims about photography, as well as her mode of argument, have become part of the rhetorical toolkit that photography theorists and critics carry around in their heads. And it does not get any more influential than that." And I think I should stop here. I mean, for the time being, with the monologue part, and pass the mic to Judith because I would love to discuss this more and answer any questions you might have. But thank you for your patience in this little introduction, and I hope it's whet your appetite to learn more about how women have been so influential to the story of art.
Hi there. I'm going to assume you heard the rapturous applause over my microphone. But if you didn't, it was there. Wow, there's so much to comment on, and I really enjoyed reading your book. I have to say, I love the terminology, the reign of women, and I'm looking forward to seeing that. Many things to call on here. And while we are speaking, there will be a little bit of a slideshow that goes up of works at the DIA by women artists. And starting off with the Artemisia, which just passed, that is actually in a show right now in Baltimore devoted specifically to women artists. So let me see, where can everyone here can see I have a huge list of questions, but not much time. So I guess one of my questions for you, because your book talks about the untold story, what was the most surprising to you of untold stories? Or what was one that maybe you wished you could have told in your book, but you couldn't, due to time, or that will maybe in your sequel?
What a great question. Well, I think what I was really searching for first was which female artists to include and which could reasonably stand in as the exemplary artist for a different period in the story of art. So first conception, and really the first 2/3 of the book, is an intro to art history, the sort that you could use in Art History 101 text as a textbook, but which used only female artists as the exemplars. And so I was first just gathering a long list of female artists, then I realized the list was going to be far too long, and I didn't want to do an encyclopedia. So I wound up zooming in on the ones that seemed to have the most influential or distinctive contributions. And there were lots of superlatives. And I think I maybe was surprised at those superlatives, not just in terms of female artists, but also many of the art museums in New York, for example, have women to thank for their existence or the way that they were shaped. And that level of influence will take people by surprise, mostly because they just assume that this is the realm of men, which is an unfortunate default assumption. Due to space, unfortunately, I had to leave out a whole chapter on women as figures depicted in works of art, when what they sometimes symbolized or represented. So if we have like a director's cut, if I was allowed 100 more pages, then that chapter would have been included, because that's also interesting, not talking about women beyond the canvas or the stone, but the ones depicted in it and what they represented. And then maybe the thing that surprised me the most, or that I wanted to sort of argue against, was what is certainly the most famous feminist art history essay ever written, Linda Nauchlin's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which I admired, but I found problematic. The problem that I found was just in the title alone. She begins with the assumption that there have been no great women artists, and then she goes on to explain why that was, and it's incredibly erudite. But at the same time, she has some phrases in there that I found to be sexist, and I thought that that was odd because this is this is the go-to feminist art history essay. And so the last chapter of my book is a sort of paragraph by paragraph breakdown of what I liked, but also what I didn't like about that essay, trying to bring in a different point of view where I'm accepting many of her arguments, most of them, in fact. And I understand that she was trying to be provocative in giving the title that she did, but I think that it's an inherently incorrect assumption that there have been no great women artists. It was a bit surprising to me when I did a close reading of it, because it doesn't strike me as particularly empowering to women when you do the close read of it. So maybe that was the biggest surprise to me.
Thank you for that. I will also forgive you for not including curators in your group as a curator myself, but we forgive you. Another question that I had was sort of about the women founders of museums, and you mentioned Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and Juliana Force, all of those women, Catherine Dreyer, who, if they weren't founders, they were curators or they were very influential for bringing art to larger publics. Do you think they were able to sneak through the cracks because the arts were in some ways considered lesser? Especially in the United States, you know, a big business, you know, world of machismo. I think this is the case that Abby Aldrich Rockefeller had to use her own money. And that she, you know, wasn't able to rely on her husband's money. So was it, you know, sort of that thing over there that the women do?
I think that was part of it, but what really came down to was the fact that what they were interested in was not something the patriarchal conservative institutions were interested in. We don't have women curators, collectors, influencers, patrons who are really focusing on acquiring old masters and displaying them. That had already been done. That was what was considered, you know, proper art for museums. And I think the benefit was these incredibly insightful women who spotted contemporary artists who were great and worth highlighting. And that was what helped them along. They were, I guess, dismissed to some extent because they were interested in something that the institutions were not interested in. In fact, if you read some of the rejection letters from the Met, having been offered these amazing collections and chances to buy these amazing artists of the 20th century, it's super pretentious and icky. So what the good thing is that a handful of very important, influential women saw the greatness of contemporary art, particularly contemporary European art, which was otherwise being dismissed by the conservative institutions of the United States. And they were the ones who brought it to the United States, and we have to thank for the fact that some of these artists are considered far more, if not important, go-to names than a lot of the old masters, which have receded into the background a bit. I'm thinking of people like Chagall, Picasso, Dali. And then we also have them supporting some women artists, which became more socially acceptable following the First World War and then the Second World War, where women entering the workplace was considered more acceptable. And socially, in terms of social dynamics, women involved in art was considered acceptable among higher class society as well, not just working class. So that was the little perfect storm that allowed that to be the case.
Thank you for that. Yes, I know Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was turned down by the Met and hence founded her own institution. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the rest of the audience. It's maybe not a question so much as an observation. Gertrude Stein is mentioned in your book, and she's at an interesting intersection because, of course, she was someone who was very interested in the most contemporary art of her time, and became a champion of those artists. And she was also Jewish, which is an interesting intersection when we think of particularly this audience and this venue for discussing your book. And you know, there was an interesting, starting I think in the 18th century, but moving into the 19th century for women, or I'll say for Jewish people, in Europe, that they created these salons, and particularly the women, and it was a way to gain entry in a way to, I'll say, the patriarchy more generally. But I don't mean only men, I mean a broader society to assimilate. The Steins were not themselves rich, and she and Leo and the other members of their family had to economize. And you know, she and Leo and Alice B. Toklas lived all together in a railroad-style apartment, which one can only imagine. But I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that, about the role of Jewish women as collectors and artists and gallerists for this audience.
Sure. She was absolutely important and pioneering among women art collectors. And these salons did allow for women, and not necessarily only wealthy ones, to be influential, to be at the center of a dynamic art scene that often required a little more investment than befriending and feeding people who were great artists, but early on in their careers before they had taken off, and were delighted to be catered to in any way because the market and the art world had not quite taken notice of them yet. She's also important as a feminist and LGBTQ plus icon, since she wrote what was called the first coming out story all the way back in 1903 about her homosexuality, though it was only published in 1950. But she was so early on. She commissioned Pablo Picasso to paint her portrait in 1903, 4 years before his breakthrough masterpiece, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, was considered the first modernist artwork. He was really living hand to mouth at the time. And so she had a great eye for picking these people out. And she was friends with the Fitzgeralds and with Ernest Hemingway, friends with Matisse. And I think it's important to also mention that she was living at a time where not only was her sexuality problematic, but also it was a dangerous road when it came to religion. And she's not a figure that's wholly without controversy, because she made a deal with the pro-Nazi Vichy government of France during the Second World War, whereby they left her and her art collection and her wife alone. But she collaborated with them, and so it's a little bit of an awkward situation retrospectively. She was close to some key Vichy figures, and so admired the Vichy leader, Marshal Philippe Pétain, that she translated his anti-Semitic speeches into English, which seems astonishing given the fact that she herself had Jewish origins. But I think this was probably a defensive tactic. She needed to protect not just her art, but her way of life. She and her partner were at high risk as a Jewish-American lesbian couple. But it's complicated, and I think it requires probably its own separate talk to jump into that, but I certainly appreciate the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to open it up to others.
Sure.
Almost at time, but I just want to see, I'm sure there are plenty of people who have questions for you. There's a hand up right here. There's a microphone coming around. Sir, do you want to raise your hand up a little higher? There you go.
Yeah, can you hear me? I just have a question. The sculptor Rodin, he had an assistant that was just as accomplished as he was. And there was a theory, or I've heard that some of his work is actually her work, because I think she was, wasn't she institutionalized for mental health reasons?
Very good question. And the one you're thinking of is Camille Claudel.
Yes.
And she is an absolutely wonderful sculptor. And the idea that some of his work is by her, it's possible, but not quite in the way that is as dramatic as you're thinking of, because she was part of his studio. And in the studio system, the master who was running the studio would be the one to receive the commissions, to design the works, but he wouldn't make all of them himself. He would have a team of people working with him, and their job was to replicate his style, because the creation of the works was a collaborative effort. There is an interesting dynamic, because she was absolutely every bit the artist he was. And she had a very strange dynamic with him. She was hired to work by Rodin in his studio in 1884, and they had a romantic off-and-on love affair for 9 years. But Rodin refused to marry her because he wanted to continue his long-term relationship with another woman who was the mother of his son and who he would later marry. But Claudel was careful to avoid his shadow. The two were inextricably linked, but she sought independent commissions, and she sought to make a name for herself, and was likely aware that the misogynistic public might assume that Rodin was the one behind her work if she didn't strike out independently. And then there's a little bit of a scandal with one bronze sculpture group called the Age of Maturity, or Destiny, or the Path of Life or Fatality, from 1899 that was commissioned by the French state, and that demonstrates just how high profile Camille Claudel was. So it's complicated, especially with the studio system. It's very confusing who made what, and the two are really inextricably linked, but she's every bit his equal. So thank you for the very good question.
Thank you. Maybe one more question? Here in front.
Thank you. How did Gentileschi break through and become recognized? It sounds like such a very small group of people that did it in the female gender. How did they do it?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's one that could also have its own lecture. But the short version is that she had the benefit of being the daughter of a very famous sculptor, Orazio Gentileschi, painter, sorry, Orazio Gentileschi, who was friends with Caravaggio and was involved in his circles. But she had a very difficult time of things. Her father, like so many Rome-based artists in the 1600s, was a follower of Caravaggio. They were even friends. And she also took up his style. But of all the imitators of the style, I think that only two, in my opinion, stand out as having equaled or surpassed Caravaggio himself, and that would be Artemisia and Giuseppe Ribera. The story was very complicated, though, and very emotional, and I always want to be hesitant about overshadowing her artistic developments because of her very dramatic and soap operatic personal story. But it was really a terrible tragedy. So there was a painter called Agostino Tassi who was hired by her father to tutor her, and he and another man raped her. And the story got more complicated because if Tassi, who was already married, were to marry Artemisia, then the father in the family might have saved face, according to the 17th century attitude. And so they continued a sexual relationship essentially against her will because Tassi was stringing Artemisia along with the expectation of marriage. And her father did not behave in what we would today think of as a very fatherly way. When it became clear there was no marriage, Orazio, the father, sued Tassi, and a trial that drew what we would consider like tabloid level interests. And the trial was a horror show, both literally and in terms of the stories that stirred to the surface. And believe it or not, Artemisia had to voluntarily undergo torture in order to prove that she wasn't lying. It's a very strange system they had then, and she was up for it, and she did so. And due to the laws of the time, the Gentileschi's had no case unless they could prove that Tassi had taken Artemisia's virginity, which was akin to ruining the Gentileschi family financially by rendering the potentially dowry-bearing daughter unmarriageable. And the trial ended unsatisfactorily. Tassi was sentenced to only 1 year in prison, but didn't serve a single day. And just a month after the trial, Orazio sorted out an arranged marriage for her. And that was the only light that came out of this. She moved to Florence with her new husband, who was an artist of little renown, but a good guy. They had a daughter, and Artemisia's independent career blossomed now that she was out of the shadow of Rome. She got commissions from the Medici in Florence, from Charles I, the King of England. She was buddies with Galileo, and she became the first woman inducted into Florence's Accademia delle Arti del Disegno. So she was the first female artist who, it can be argued, very significantly contributed to the art of her time. There may have been ancient women artists who did that, but we don't know enough about them. In short, she influenced male artists. And so this is a happy legacy to a very dark and stormy personal experience. But it was only by the strength of her will and when she left the shadow of her family in Rome that she was able to make a career for herself, and she really made a very great career. And I love this quote from her that I'll always remember. It's a strong proto-feminist statement. She said, quote, "As long as I live, I will have control over my being."
Thank you, Noah. Thank you so much for your amazing talk today. I think everyone learned a lot, and I'm hoping people will have an opportunity to explore in the galleries afterward. I want to thank Rachel here, our interpreter today. And as a final note, keep exploring the galleries. We're acquiring works by women all the time. Almost every single collections committee meeting, I think 2 or 3 meetings ago, every single work that we acquired was by a woman. It wasn't by design. And it was the first time in my career of, I won't say how many years, that has ever happened in my professional career. So that was pretty amazing for me to participate in. But as I say, we're adding all the time.
Hello, I am Suzanne Simon.
And I'm Brenda Brook, and Suzanne and I are co-chairs of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair. We want to thank Dr. Noah Charney from Berlin and his conversation partner, Judith Dolkart, the DIA Deputy Director, and all of you for being here with us today for this amazing journey.
All of you got this little flyer from Schuler Bookstore. We'd like to remind you that starting today till next Saturday, if you purchase anything at their store and mention the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, the J will receive a 20% part of your to support the center. So we hope that you will shop there. And we want to now follow us to the Great Hall and for a docent-lent tour and to purchase Dr. Charney's best-selling book, Brushed Aside. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.